I'm Kristyn Zajac. I'm an associate professor at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine, and I'm a clinical psychologist by training. Some of you might know me. I definitely recognize a lot of names on the group today because I have a couple of ongoing projects that I am working on with all of you at the Root Center at a few different Root Center locations. I have 2 ongoing clinical trials and then 2 other smaller projects. So I've been really grateful and lucky to be able to collaborate with some of you all. I also just want to say thank you for inviting me to do this Grand Rounds. I'm going to be talking about a project that I'm very excited about, a project that I haven't talked to any of you at Root Center about yet, but I'm eager to get any feedback or questions about it and for you all to learn more about it. I'm also going to be talking more broadly about community-based participatory research, which is a really exciting research approach that we're using on this particular project. I'll talk about what it is and why it's important. And then I'll tell you about CHEARR, which is a project focused on young adults who take medications for opioid use disorder and how we're using CBVR in the project. So the title is kind of a mouthful. It's nothing about us without us, building capacity for community engaged research on recovery supports for young adults with opioid use disorder. And I'm going to break down each piece of that title as we go through the presentation. So in terms of disclosures, I don't have any disclosures or conflict of interest to report, but I did want to talk a little bit about funding. So my research is funded by the National Institutes of Health through the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. The actual project I'm talking about today, CHEARR, is funded by NIDA under NIH's Helping to End Addiction Long-Term initiative, the HEAL initiative. And I also wanted to just point out that I'm a co-investigator on the Root Center for Advanced Recovery Endowment Grant. I'm not talking about that project today, but I wanted to just acknowledge it and thank you all for supporting that project. So an overview of what I'm going to be speaking about, I'll talk some about what is community-based participatory research, why it's important. Some of you might already be familiar with some of these approaches. And then I'll describe the collaborative hub for emerging adult recovery research that we call CHEARR. We'll talk about the aims of that project and how we're using CBVR to make it a successful project. As part of CHEARR, we're focusing on young adults and opioid use disorder, particularly young adults who take medications to treat opioid use disorder. And I'll talk about why we're focusing on that particular population and why we're studying recovery support services and what I even mean by those things. So I'll start by talking about what is community-based participatory research. So this is the formal definition. So it's a collaborative research approach that's designed to ensure and establish structures for participation by communities affected by the issue being studied, representatives of organizations, and researchers in all aspects of the research process to improve health and well-being through taking action, including social change. So there's a lot of different concepts in here, but first off, CBVR is not necessarily a research method or a way that we do research. It's an approach to research. And historically, a lot of research in the field of substance use and in social science more generally has not taken this approach. It's kind of taken more of a top-down approach where the researchers come up with the research ideas and then implement research projects. And sometimes those are very successful and sometimes they're not. But the CBVR approach really takes a different approach where researchers are kind of seen as outsiders who really need to partner with communities to answer research questions that are relevant to those communities. And so it changes the dynamics in terms of how research is being conducted. And so there's a couple parts of this definition that I wanted to highlight. First is that the participation is by communities affected by the issue. And when we say communities affected by the issue, this can be really broadly defined, but it typically includes patients, providers with firsthand experience treating those patients, family members of patients, key community leaders, et cetera. And who's included within that community depends on kind of the types of research questions or the types of research problems being addressed. So for example, if you're doing studies on cancer care, that community might include patients who are currently in treatment for cancer or in remission from cancer. It could include family members of patients with cancer or who went through cancer treatments. It could include providers like doctors, nurses, medical staff, et cetera, involved in cancer care. It would depend kind of on the question and the problems you're trying to address with the research. When we think about the opioid epidemic, we want to include voices of current patients, people in recovery, treatment providers, peer recovery support, staff at treatment centers, counselors, et cetera, to get as much insight as possible from people with this lived experience so that we're asking the right research questions and we're going about research in a way that's going to be most helpful for the community impacted. The other part of the definition I wanted to highlight is in all aspects. So I'll talk in a minute about kind of different levels of community engagement that we have in various research projects. But in community-based participatory research, the community has to be engaged in all aspects of the research. And that means from the very beginning, when we're just trying to formulate what research questions we're trying to ask, the community should be involved in that part. They should also be involved in designing how the study is going to be conducted, in what settings it's going to be conducted, and with whom. And then towards the end of the research process, they should be involved in interpreting the research findings and disseminating the research findings to communities, back to the community in a way that it can be understood by the community and in all aspects of the community that needs to know about those findings. And then the third piece is to improve health and well-being. So community-based participatory research is not doing research just for the sake of building knowledge or answering a question just for the sake of answering the question. The end result has to be that we're improving the health and well-being of that community in some actionable way. Okay, so talking about kind of a continuum of community engagement and research, we think that any level of community engagement is better than no community engagement when it comes particularly to doing research on substance use treatment. And so here's a visual to help orient you to where CBVR falls in terms of the community engagement. And I'll start by pointing out that some biomedical research does not include any degree of community engagement and won't ever be represented in this diagram. And that's actually okay. So when we think about certain types of research, we might think of someone working in like a wet lab with cells or with rats, and they might be doing research that's really, really crucial, kind of early stage basic science research, and there might not be any community involvement at that stage. And that's okay. We're not criticizing those types of research. All kinds of research is really important. But when we start thinking about research where we're actually designing interventions to help people in community settings or certain marginalized populations, we really want to start thinking about how do we partner with community members on this research to make it better research and to make it more relevant to those communities. So on this spectrum, we see CBVR all the way on the left-hand side. So this, again, is full involvement in all parts of the study, development, and conduct. There's also CBVR light, as we call it. So there's partial involvement in some or all parts of the study development and conduct. So maybe the researcher comes up with a question, the research question that needs to be addressed, but then they partner with the community on how to do that research and how to disseminate those results. There's community-based research, which is research conducted in collaboration with members of the community. And for you all that work at Root Center, you probably have a lot of community-based research going on. If it's being conducted at Root Center in partnership with an educational institution or a hospital or medical center, it's probably community-based research. And so this stuff is really important too, where we have community agencies that are willing to partner with us, help us recruit samples, help us understand the results of our study in the context of real-world clinical settings. So this research is also important. And then there's community engagement. So working with community members and agencies to reach community members. So this might be things like, a researcher conducts a research study and then takes the results out to the community and helps the community understand those findings. So all levels of community engagement are great. The CBVR tends to be the kind of research that has full community involvement. And maybe less common, might not be as familiar to you all. Here's another way to think about it. So this is 3 levels of community partnership. So community targeted, and again, all of these are good things. We want to think about community partnerships and research as being really important, and these are just kind of 3 different levels. So community targeted research means there's no community involvement in selecting the research topic, but the community does partner with the researchers for recruitment and dissemination. Community-based means that the community gives some input. They might have a vote in selecting the research topic, and there's increased involvement in many aspects of the research. And then there's community-driven research, which is where there's shared power and decision-making between community members and researchers, and the focus area is generated by the community. On the super far right end, we might even have projects where a community agency or a community of patients come up with a problem that needs to be solved, that can only be solved by research, and comes to the research community on their own accord to seek help for answering that research question. So that's an example of a truly a research question that truly comes from a grassroots, from the community itself. So going back to CBVR, there are kind of 9 key principles that we follow. The first one is that it recognizes the community as a unit of identity. And so in terms of what that means there's a common characteristic among the community being partnered with. For the CHEARR project that I'm talking about today, we're focusing on young adults in recovery from opioid use disorder. And so that's our community that we're partnering with. Second, it builds on the strengths and resources within the community. So the projects recognize that there are needs within the community and maybe problems within the community that need to be addressed, but also builds on the strengths and resources in that community as well. Third is that CPPR facilitates collaborative partnerships in all phases of the research. So the communities share control with the researchers on all aspects of the project. 4, it integrates knowledge and action for mutual benefit of all partners. So the project has to produce a measurable impact on the community. It can't just, again, be a research question just for knowledge's sake. 5 is it promotes a co-learning and empowering process that attends to social inequalities. So it recognizes inequalities and differences. It recognizes that historically there's been a very strong power differential between the research community and the communities being studied, and it tries to equal that, the playing field. It also recognizes that there have been real reasons for certain populations to develop a mistrust of the research community, because there's a long history of researchers doing things that were not ethical or took advantage of certain populations, and that researchers really need to mend those relationships and develop trust with communities, particularly marginalized communities. It involves a cyclical and incremental process. So the information and expertise flows in both directions, from the research team to the community and then back. It recognizes that the research team comes with expertise in research processes and research design, but that the community is coming with key expertise in the problem being addressed. So those with lived experience with opioid use disorder have key essential knowledge that's needed to advance research in this field. It addresses health from both positive and ecological perspectives. So it addresses things like social determinants of health and focuses on physical, mental, and social well-being. 8 is it disseminates findings and knowledge gained to all partners. So results need to be shared with communities in understandable language, and interpreted and published with community involvement. So we can't just kind of send our community partners a peer-reviewed journal article with lots of jargon in it. We need to find ways that are actually helpful to them. And more kind of we're leaning on things like social media platforms and tip sheets and things that kind of distill information in ways that are actually helpful to communities. And finally, the partnership has to involve a long-term commitment. So it can't just be, we're going to put together some community boards and they're going to focus on one project, and after a year or two we'll disband and we'll never speak to each other again. It's really making a long-term commitment between the community and the research team. And so if you're working on grant-funded research like I do, it's about finding ways to sustain those partnerships past the grant funding period. So why is CBVR so important? And I've kind of alluded to some of this, but it's particularly important when we're conducting research with marginalized or stigmatized populations, as they really have had very little say in research conducted on and about them. And so it's that idea of nothing about us without us. If we are developing interventions and supports for people who are in recovery, they certainly should have a say in what those things, how we should focus our attention. And when we think about the fact that so much of this research is funded by federal sources, we have even more of a responsibility to make sure that the voices of these communities are heard, because this should be their research too. And so as an example, I do a lot of research on treatments and interventions for substance use problems, psychosocial interventions. And historically, a lot of the research in this area has taken kind of a top-down approach, with ideas primarily generated by the researchers and then tested in research studies. And a lot of times this comes from a really good place. Researchers are often practitioners. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I have some clinical experience with various populations. But they tend to be done in settings, a lot of them have been done in settings that are not as real world as we would like them to be. So they might be done in lab settings or academic medical settings that are not community-based settings. Or they might be done in partnership with community settings, but being done with heavy researcher involvement. And so they're not mimicking how they would look in the real world. And although we've had amazing advances come from research conducted like this, sometimes the findings are not always translatable into real world practice. And sometimes our interventions are not acceptable to patients and providers. And so there's not really a chance for them to be used in real world settings if no one wants them. And finally, sometimes the interventions don't work in existing treatment settings. So if they're tested in non-real world settings or lab settings or even academic medical settings, when we go out to community practice where most people get their treatment, those systems sometimes look very different. Some of our interventions don't work in those settings. And so there's really a push to make more and more of our research community-based participatory, where we're getting voices from patients and providers in community settings to make sure that what we are developing and researching will actually work in those settings. And that can be kind of along that spectrum of community-based research. It doesn't have to be CBVR, but we want more and more of that community involvement. And all of this makes research better. It makes the findings more relevant to the real world, and it makes it more likely that we're going to be able to improve treatment outcomes and help people in recovery, which I know is what we all want to do. So now I'm going to move on. Any questions about CBVR before I move on to CHEARR? I can't really see anybody. So if anybody has anything to say, just speak up. Okay. I'm going to move on and talk about what is CHEARR. So CHEARR, next slide. CHEARR stands for the Collaborative Hub for Emerging Adult Recovery Research. This was funded about a year ago by the National Institute on Drug Abuse as part of that HEAL initiative. And the primary goals are to create the infrastructure needed to conduct high-quality research on recovery support services for young adults ages 16 to 25 who take medications for opioid use disorder. So the history here is that in 2020, the National Institute on Drug Abuse put out a call for these types of projects focused on recovery support services. And what they basically said was, we know that there are all of these amazing recovery support services broadly defined out in community settings. They're being developed and they're being disseminated, and we think they're incredibly helpful. But the research on these recovery support services has really lagged behind. We have very little high quality research in this area. And so they funded an initial round of these 5, they're called R24s, but they're infrastructure grants, 5 grants across the US to tackle different areas of recovery support services with different types of populations. And those 5 initial projects were so successful that they decided to fund 3 more. So in 2022, we were lucky to get one of these, and they were particularly focused on clinical continuing care models, and were particularly focused on young adults. And they wanted all of the projects to focus on people in recovery taking medications for opioid use disorder, because we know that that the medications are really effective, and that folks are doing really well in recovery, but that there are some unmet needs among people taking these medications that can be addressed through recovery support services, as you all know, because you're doing a lot of this work right at the Root Center. So what our project at CHEARR includes is developing infrastructure. So that means things like just kind of developing what are the novel research ideas that we need to address in this area, what are the approaches, and that these research ideas and approaches need to be driven by the communities impacted by opioid use disorder. Second, we are developing a pipeline of researchers trained to do this type of work. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We're trying to improve awareness in the research community that more work is needed in this area. So there are, incredibly talented researchers doing all kinds of interesting research on how to help people struggling with substance use problems, but not a lot of these researchers are focusing on recovery support services specifically. So we're trying to push kind of an all hands on deck approach. So we need more people focusing in this area of research. And then we're developing concrete tools that are essential to conduct research. So things like assessment measures of outcomes relevant to recovery support services, and research methods for assessing effectiveness of recovery support services. So why the focus on young adults? I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. And as some of you who might know me from a couple of different research projects at Root Center, a lot of my work focuses on young adults. It's a group that I'm super passionate about. I'll talk a little bit about why. So this developmental period from about 16 to 17 all the way through the mid-20s is just a time of amazing growth and new opportunities, as well as a lot of change and instability, and kind of a lot of vulnerability. There's a lot of stuff going on during this time period that can put kids at risk or young adults at risk. And one thing as a strength and an area of growth is that their functional abilities are really increasing over this time period, along with their psychosocial development. So as they get to be in their early 20s, they're more expected to contribute to or even become a head of a household. They're expected to become more financially self-supporting, complete their schooling or training, develop a social network, be a good citizen, and obtain and maintain rewarding work. And there are certainly things that can kind of pop up and become barriers to all of these developmental milestones that we're expecting young people to meet. So in terms of some developmental considerations, this is also the time period, kind of adolescence through early adulthood, where sexual development is occurring, and they're establishing romantic relationships. And these peer and romantic relationships really become of paramount importance during this time period, where the peer groups and the folks that the young people are hanging out with can really influence them in either positive or negative ways. There's also a lot of family role changes happening. The transition from being kind of a dependent child to a more independent adult is stressful. I think if we all kind of think back on our late teens, early 20s, we can think about how that was such a unique period in our lives, and how so much changed during that period. And for young people, we think of families becoming less and less of an important part of their lives as they get older and they kind of age into adulthood. But actually, the family of origin is so important during this time period, and provides a lot of support. And so for young adults who don't have strong support systems, maybe they're parents are struggling with their own mental health or substance use problems, or are incarcerated, or are just not emotionally available to them, that can be a big barrier for young adults kind of navigating this developmental period. And then, of course, there's identity formation. This is kind of when we figure out, how do we want to present ourselves to the world? How do we want the world to treat me? What do you believe in? What are your values? What are you going to do with your life? Although some of us are still figuring some of that out. And then, an important question that young adults are trying to answer is, who am I independent of my family? And how am I going to kind of move forward into the next stages of my life? So these are big things going on, and they can certainly be complicated by struggles with substance use. And then the other piece I want to talk about is kind of typical cognitive development. So we often think about how the brain kind of is continuing to develop all the way up to age 30, and particularly in areas of executive functioning. And so these areas are things like being able to be planful, kind of planning ahead and not just thinking about the present, but thinking about tomorrow and the next day and the next week and the next year. Persevering and working towards a goal over time. So again, being able to think future forward. You're not just working for a goal for today, but you're working for a goal for tomorrow. The parts of the brain that control these processes are not fully developed at this age. Also, things around using good judgment, making good, safe decisions, and not being sidetracked by impulsive decisions. All of those brain processes are not done. And so we often, as a society, sometimes we think someone turns 18 or someone turns 21 or however you want to define it, and they're an adult. But the reality is their brain's saying, we're not quite there yet. We need a couple more years to develop. And I, again, certainly thinking back on my own 20s, kind of maybe wondering, why did I make that decision? Or why couldn't I have followed through with that bigger thing that I was trying to follow through on? And that might be a function of just not having your brain fully developed quite yet. And so when we think about young adults who are also struggling with substance use, or who were trying to engage in treatment, taking into consideration some of these brain processes is really important. And some of you know we have an ongoing study with Root Center called the P2P project, where we're actually measuring executive functioning in young adults. If you ever want to, we have a little executive functioning measurement apparatus set up at the Henderson Johnson Clinic if you ever want to stop by and check it out. But it's something that we're focusing on in our work, and trying to understand how executive functioning might influence young adults' ability to stick with treatment. So all that to say, we're CHEARR's focused on young adults who are struggling with opioid use disorder. And the reason that we're focusing on that, I'm kind of preaching to the choir. Young adults are at higher risk for misusing opioids and developing opioid use disorder than any other age group. And they're really kind of challenging to engage in formal treatment services. They don't show up at the rates we expect them to in formal treatment settings. And when they do show up, they often drop out before they can kind of get benefit from it. So for example, there's really high dropout rates from medications for opioid use disorders among this age group, often within a few weeks of initiation. And in 2021, we lost over 7,400 people in this age group in the US to drug overdose, and a majority of those were opioid related. So this is an age group that really needs our attention and needs kind of innovative solutions to helping them in recovery. Here's another kind of consideration for young adults, is that they have incredibly high rates of co-occurring disorders, meaning substance use along with a mental illness. So the data that are on this slide are from a general population study of adults in the US. And the first bar over on the left that says 18 or older, this is the rate of co-occurring mental illness and substance use disorder in the past year in a general population, so 4%. And then if we look at the next set of bars, this breaks it out by age group. So you'll see the 18 to 25 group is about double the rates of the 26 to 49 group when we look at rates of co-occurring problems. And this also translates to the young adults that we see in treatment for substance use disorders, that they tend to have high rates of co-occurring mental health problems. They also have very high rates of polysubstance use. So for young adults who use heroin, for example, over 96% of them use with other drugs, which of course increases risk for adverse events like overdose deaths. And so taking into consideration co-occurring mental health problems and polysubstance use is really important in this population, as it is with other age groups as well, but it is particularly prevalent for young adults. This is a more complicated table. These data actually come from a study of psychotherapy services, and it's about the proportion of age groups in treatment and whether they kind of persist in treatment or not. So the darker bars are mature adults, the lighter bars are young adults ages 18 to 25. The persister group, the group all the way on the right, that group is the group of people who kind of persist and complete their treatment as prescribed. The rapid desisters, the ones all the way on the left, are the ones that start treatment but kind of rapidly drop out within the first couple of months. And then the slow desisters are the ones that drop out of treatment before the providers thought they should, but stayed with treatment a little bit longer than the rapid desisters. So you'll see that the young adults are disproportionately represented in both groups of people that drop out of treatment early, and way underrepresented in the group of people who persist and complete their treatments. So 70% of young adults in outpatient treatment attend 3 or fewer of the sessions that they're supposed to go to. So creative thinking on how to engage and treat young adults is really urgently needed. And when we think about treatments for young adults or support services for young adults, there certainly is a complex set of targets. They often have a lot going on in their lives in terms of, as I talked about before, kind of relationship instability, residential instability, complex family and social network arrangements, low engagement and retention in treatment, and some of those developmental considerations, including things like executive functioning. And really historically, and even now, most treatment development and evaluation studies in the substance use field group all adults together. So 18 to 100 would be the population of adults that might be enrolled in a treatment study, with very little consideration that an 18-year-old is going to look a lot different than even a 30-year-old, and definitely than a 40 or a 50-year-old in terms of their treatment needs, and also how they're going to respond to those treatments or services. And so a lot of my work is focused on developing and evaluating interventions specifically for emerging adults or young adults. The other piece here that we focus on in CHEARR, but that's important to consider when we think about young adults, is recovery capital. So recovery capital is the internal and external resources that can be mobilized to promote or sustain substance use recovery. And this includes things like tangible capital, like money, housing, are their basic needs met, personal characteristics like their skills in education, coping skills, mental health, social capital, like access to and engagement with sober activities, with sober family members and sober supports, perceived community capital, so awareness of resources in their communities, stigma in their communities around accessing those resources, culturally appropriate supports, and community involvement. So recovery capital is becoming an area of where a lot of research is happening, but there's very little empirical research on recovery capital on young adults. And there's lots of reason to believe that recovery capital might look different in this age group. But we do, so nearly all the research in this area is on more mature adults, or kind of group more mature adults with younger adults. And the studies that do look at differences between young adults and older adults find that recovery capital, at least how we're measuring it right now, is much lower for young adults. There's a lack of recovery-focused peer social support, which is a major barrier to recovery. And there are currently no recovery capital assessments that are developed and validated for young adults. And when we look at the recovery capital assessments developed for adults more generally, a lot of the language is not super appropriate for young adults. And some of the aspects of recovery capital that they're measuring are not as relevant to young adults. So I'll talk some about how we're going to address this. So why are we focused on recovery support services? So when I talk about recovery support services, I'm talking about a pretty broad umbrella of different types of things. So I'm talking about recovery residences, recovery community centers, peer recovery support specialists and recovery coaches, recovery high schools, collegiate recovery programs, clinical continuing care models, among many other things, can kind of fall under this umbrella of recovery support services. And so our funder recognizes that recovery support services likely play a really important role in supporting people in long-term recovery, but very little research has been done in this area. And we now have some effective treatment for opioid use disorder, particularly our medications for opioid use disorder. But many people, even if they're very successful in these treatments, need additional and ongoing support to achieve and maintain long-term recovery. So I think our communities have been doing an amazing job of developing these recovery support services, implementing the recovery support services, but the research field has lagged behind. And so the researchers need to kind of step up and start doing more high quality research on the effectiveness of these services, for whom they work best and in what context, and how to best implement them and make them available to patients who need them. So here is our CHEARR team, just to give you a sense of who we are. I'm the principal investigator here at UConn Health. Laura Kelly is a co-investigator at UMass Medical School. Angela Hageman is at East Tennessee State University. Phil Valentine, I think many of you probably know him. He is also a co-investigator on the study, and he's at the Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery. Ashley Shado is at Chestnut Health Systems. Marianne Davis at UMass. Tricia Lozier is here at UConn Health with me as project support. Eden Buell is also project support with Chestnut Health Systems. And then we have our very first student intern, Ayat Syed. And this is what we consider the research side of the team. So we are the investigator side of the team, and we are currently building our community side of the team, which I will talk about now. These are our community boards. So because we're focusing on young adults who take or who have taken medications for opioid use disorder, and we're focusing on recovery support services for this population, we're developing 2 community boards that will guide all aspects of CHEARR. So our young adults will be ages 18 to 28, and the only requirement is that they currently take or have taken medications for opioid use disorder. Whether or not they had positive or negative experiences, we actually want a range of experiences on the board. And then the peer recovery support specialist board will be folks that are currently working as peer recovery support specialists or recovery coaches or similar, have experience working with young adults, and have experience supporting people who take medications for opioid use disorder. The other kind of broader requirements is that basically that folks are willing to kind of share their time with us, that they have time to meet with other community board members once a month for 90 minutes, but also that they're passionate about the topic area and that they are willing to kind of bring back any information and results of research back to the communities where they come from. And then finally, we are making efforts to ensure that these community boards are diverse in terms of we want people from all across the US, different types of geographical areas, urban, rural, suburban. We're looking to make these boards diverse in terms of racial and ethnic makeup, and also make sure that we have representation from certain marginalized communities like the LGBT community. In terms of where we are in the process, we are currently finishing up our interviews for both boards. We got an overwhelming response to the Peer Recovery Support Specialist Board. We got 70 applications for our 12 spots, and we are interviewing now to fill those spots. We also are interviewing for the Young Adult Board, although we are still accepting applications for that board. If you happen to know young adults who might be interested in getting involved, they can find out more about it on our website, which is CHEARR.org, and they also could submit an application there. So what will the CHEARR community boards do? So based on everything I talked about with CBVR, it's no surprise that I'm going to say they're going to do everything. So they're going to co-lead with the investigative team all aspects of CHEARR. And again, CHEARR's mission we have multiple aims. And so we're identifying research priorities, co-developing assessment measures. They're going to help us choose the trainees that we will have go through our student internship and postdoctoral fellowship. They're going to help us select pilot projects for funding and co-develop resources. And I'm going to talk more about some of these things. So the first aim of our project, and kind of the biggest aim, is to help identify research priorities. And these are just a couple of examples of questions that we're going to turn over to our boards. So we want to know from them what aspects of recovery support services for young adults taking medications for opioid use disorder should researchers focus on? What are the unmet needs of these young people? What recovery-related outcomes are most important to young people? How can researchers best engage young people in research on this topic? And many more. So this really, we are going to be kind of tasking the community boards with coming up from their perspective, what should the researchers be doing? And trying to make sure that we're not interfering with their process of coming up with those priorities. And then it's the researcher's job to help turn those ideas into testable research questions. The second aim is, I kind of alluded to this before, but to develop an assessment tool for recovery capital specific to young adults. I already kind of gave the definition of recovery capital, so I won't repeat it. But understanding recovery capital is a key, important piece of the puzzle in terms of understanding what young people need to support their recovery. And although there's some validated measures of recovery capital available to researchers and clinicians, none are specific to young adults. And so we know that there's likely specific considerations related to recovery capital that might not be captured by those existing measures. And the language of some of these measures are just not that appropriate for young adults. So what will the community boards do? So the CHEARR team has already compiled all of the existing assessment items from tools that are currently being used. And the community boards will be tasked with reviewing existing items, identifying gaps in recovery capital specific to young adults, rewording items to make them more relatable and understandable to young adults, and eliminating items that are not relevant and proposing new items that might be relevant. What's going on now is that because we're using a measure that's measures that are not very appropriate for young adults, we don't think we're really getting a full understanding of all of the recovery capital that is available to young adults and all the strengths that they bring to recovery. Our second aim is to provide a hub for science on recovery support services for young adults who take MOUDs. And so we're developing a range of tools to help researchers in the community, like tip sheets, social media posts, white papers, technical reports, webinars, and trainings. And we're also trying to develop a national presence through conference presentations with a specific focus on targeting the research community to get more researchers excited about doing research in this area and partnering with communities impacted by the opioid crisis. So we'll be doing a host of national presentations at various national research conferences to expose our fellow scientists. But we're also, on the flip side of that, going to be developing some research presentations for recovery-oriented conferences. For example, CHEARR's Multiple Pathways to Recovery Conference, so that we can start getting a research presence in those areas, and hopefully that will lead to kind of ongoing and new partnerships with the recovery community. Aim 3 is to create a pipeline of researchers trained to conduct high-quality studies on the topic. So we have funding. We wrote funding into this grant for 2 postdoctoral fellows. So postdoctoral fellows are those that complete their PhD but need additional training to help launch their research careers in a specific area. So this would help launch their research career in recovery support services research. It would provide 2 years of paid training, so that they can get paid while they're doing their fellowship. And then also it pays for some additional training opportunities, travel, and things like that to help support their careers. We also have a student internship. This would be for undergraduate students, although we're considering taking graduate students and medical students as well. We're interested in pursuing training and a career related to recovery research. So we know that in order to think into the future about doing high quality research in this area, that we need to be training the next generation of researchers. And for both of these opportunities, we are prioritizing applicants who have lived experience with their own personal recovery or with familial substance use problems. And so a long-term goal is to make sure that a higher proportion of the researchers doing research in this area actually are in recovery themselves and have their own lived experience that they can draw upon to do high quality research. Let me also talk about what are the community boards doing for this. So they're going to help us review applications and help choose the best candidates for these opportunities. And then the student interns and the postdoctoral fellows will also get training on how to partner with community boards and have chances to interact with our community boards, to learn from them, so that they can kind of be able to do this type of community engaged research in their own careers. And then the final aim is to provide pilot study funding to help generate new research. So we will have a national call for applications for pilot project proposals focused on recovery support services for young adults taking MOUDs. The topics that we prioritize will be identified by the community boards, and community board members will partner with us to review and select proposals for funding. All the pilots will be required to include the recovery measure that's co-developed by the research team and the community boards. And this will help generate pilot studies are just small studies that generate some data that can be used for bigger grant applications to fund bigger studies that will advance the field on recovery support services. So importantly, we've been thinking about historically how sometimes in community engaged research, even though researchers have usually good intentions for partnering with communities, that sometimes there's a sense that there's tokenism. So tokenism is the practice of making only a perfunctory or symbolic effort to do a particular thing, especially by recruiting a small number of people from underrepresented groups. So an example of this would be, you have a board of directors that's made up of all white men, and you offer a seat at the table to a single African-American woman or white woman or someone that's different from the rest of that group. And although that person has, in theory, a seat at the table, there are a lot of power dynamics in that group that make it really challenging for that single person to make a difference. So for outward appearance, there's some tokenism going on. Yes, you have some representation on that board, but it's not true representation. So what are we doing to make sure that we're not engaging in tokenism? The other thing about tokenism that's really important is that sometimes tokenism can look like, you're kind of taking advantage of folks, that you're asking them for their opinions and their feedback, but you're not kind of really engaging them in the process. You're not partnering with them, and you're not compensating them for their time. And so all of these things we've considered as we're designing CHEARR. So first of all, we're offering more than a seat at the table. We've designed our community boards to be entire tables so that the researchers are not on those community boards. Our boards are either young adults or peer recovery support specialists. And when they look around that table, they're only going to see their peers. We will have kind of an administrative person in those board meetings to help take notes and to keep people on schedule, but otherwise the boards will run themselves. They'll make their own rules around safeguards and guardrails and how they want to operate and how they want to talk to one another. And so there's less opportunity for people's voices to kind of be shut down. Two, we have representation of lived experience related to recovery and familial substance use throughout our team, not just the community boards. So our investigative team has people in recovery and has people who have lived experience with family substance use. We also are hiring our postdoctoral fellowship and our postdoctoral fellow and our student internship, prioritizing candidates that have lived experience. And we are hiring staff members. When we hire staff members, we also prioritize folks that have lived experience. And so the goal here is to try to have people with lived experience throughout the project, so that there's not the feeling that one person has to speak up for an entire community. Third, we're aiming to support people with lived experience, not only to have a job, but to become leaders in the field. So with our postdoctoral fellowship, we are training future research leaders, same with our student internship. With our staff member positions, we're offering jobs with very competitive pay and with very competitive benefit packages. We're not kind of paying people less, and we're not taking advantage of the fact that they have lived experience. We are making them full members of our teams. I mentioned this, but we're doing fair and equal compensation. And for our community boards, we did a lot of research on what that compensation should be, what's kind of a fair price, to make people feel as if they're really being valued. And we've put that, we've found the money to be able to do that. We're also seeking out voices that are new and different. So nationally, if you look at community boards, you tend to start seeing the same faces over and over. And we're trying to get people on our community boards that have not been on boards before, that are new voices, and not just pro-research voices. We are looking for folks that maybe have a healthy degree of skepticism about the research community, because we need that perspective as well. And finally, I mentioned this earlier with the community boards, but we're seeking out voices that have been underrepresented in research, particularly racial and ethnic minorities and people from the LGBT community, and also people from rural areas. So what are the takeaways that I hope that you've gotten from this presentation? Community-based participatory research is crucial to advancing the field on recovery support services, because it ensures that the voices of impacted communities and those who serve those communities are true partners in the research. And this is the kind of research that I think we should be doing more and more when it comes to the recovery field. CHEARR is a CBVR-based project that focuses on advancing recovery, research on recovery support services for young adults who take MOUDs. And also a big takeaway, I hope that you got something around why young adults might be as kind of a unique population when we think about addiction treatment, and that they have different strengths, needs, and priorities when it comes to recovery, and that they've been disproportionately impacted by the opioid crisis. I'm going to put one final plug for our young adult board. So if you know a young adult who's ever been prescribed medication for the treatment of opioid use disorder, and is between the ages of 18 to 28 and is passionate about using their voice to improve recovery support services for OUD, please have them reach out to us. It's cheerr.org, and there's opportunities for paid community board membership. And then finally, I want to leave this up for a minute. So please kind of reach out to us. We have a website. We have very new social media accounts. We have a Facebook page. We have Twitter. I know that's not the current symbol for Twitter, I just realized. And we have Instagram. When I say these are very new accounts, we have few followers, and we would love it if you could just log on, even if you can log on right now and follow us. We don't have a whole lot of content yet, but we will have more content in the future. I also wanted to give a quick plug for the Consortium on Addiction Recovery, also known as COARs. If you want to learn more about other projects like CHEARR that are focused on different areas of recovery support, research, and different populations, you can go to their website, and there's also opportunities to get involved in those projects. And then that's my email address and name if you wanted to reach out to me. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts?